So good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. For those tuning in from Kenya, and good morning for the rest. Thanks a lot for joining this forum today. My name is Jacqueline Kagume, and I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs as a program officer. The IEA is a public policy think tank based here in Nairobi, and our mission is to inform decision-making in Kenya and beyond by contributing to the formulation of rational public policies through evidence-based research, policy innovation, and dialogues. So we welcome you to IEA's 21st webinar of 2021, where we'll be discussing Africa's population structure and development, with some comparative perspectives from China. And specifically, we'll be asking of what relevance is China's economic demography transition. So to discuss the topic that we have today, we have one keynote speaker who you can see on your screen as well, Dr. Lauren Johnston. I will introduce her properly in a short while. So she will make her presentation, and then we will have some comments and some feedback from my colleagues at the IEA, including our CEO, Mr. Kwame Owino, Maureen Barasa, and Anna Grace Kemunto. So we will then later open the discussion to plenary, but as we go along, I invite you to note down any questions that you might have in the chat box that is available on this platform. Before I introduce the main speaker, I'll try and provide a very brief background, just to try and put the discussion today in context. And I'm sure that most of us have heard varying arguments regarding the link between population structure, including growth rates and development. On one line, we have arguments that seem to link high birth rates with growing poverty and suboptimal development, and especially here on the African continent. We have a similar school of thought that argues that rapid population growth is likely to pose significant challenges for various government policies, and primarily the ones that are aimed at promoting the well-being of citizens. So that's on the one hand. And you may also have heard of some opposing arguments suggesting that low population growth rates would likely lead to a shrinking labor force, which would consequently be bad for development. So given these different sets of arguments, any good scholar would then ask, so what does the evidence say? Or what does existing data suggest as the link between population structure and development? Now, China provides a very useful reference point, given that it represents one of the world's most conspicuous experiments if you look at rapid economic development. The rapid development that was seen in China was also accompanied by significant changes in the population size and structure in that country, following what some or all of you may recall as the one-child policy that was instituted informally towards 1978 and 79, and formally strict enforcement around from 1980. So today, many demographers and economists think that the population growth that we see in sub-Saharan Africa will play a very decisive role in terms of the overall economic development of the continent. And the reason for this is that many African countries seem to have low or middle-sized populations right now, but they still retain very high total fertility rates, and therefore have what has been termed as child-rich populations. So many African countries have long-term development plans that allude or mention the term demographic transition towards low dependency and a higher share of the population in the working ages. So it is argued here that the change in population structure, it goes this way, would likely reduce dependency, create higher labor numbers, and spur productivity. So the question then that we ask today is, whether China's demographic transition model, the evidence that we can see from the lines, the lines that we saw in China, whether this could provide broad lessons for Africa and by extension for Kenya. And to help us now answer these questions, we are pleased to be joined by Dr. Lauren Johnston, who I had mentioned earlier, and she's widely published on China-Africa economic relations and economic demography topics. So Dr. Lauren Johnson is a visiting senior lecturer at the University of Adelaide's Institute of International Trade. And she's also a research fellow at the Faculty of Law and Social Sciences at Mohammed B University in Rabat. She's also a research associate at the China Institute of the University of London. She's undertaken extensive research on China's trade and investment ties with Africa in particular, and the domestic and international impacts of population aging in China. Currently, through a consultancy that she founded, she's a lead consultant for a World Bank research project on impacts for China and the world economy of population aging in China. She's further a member of the African Economics and Finance Association Research Committee and a member of the Chinese Economists Society of the US and Australia. Dr. Lauren holds a PhD in economics from Peking University and an MSc in development economics. So thanks a lot, Dr. Lauren, for joining us. I'd now like to invite you to make your presentation. And for the rest of us, please let's remember to have our microphones off and videos as well, since this is a recorded session, to allow her to make her presentation very easily. So welcome, Dr. Lauren Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the welcome and the introduction that really helped set the tone. And thank you also to Kwame for this invitation. I'm not sure if you can see the presentation. Can you all see the presentation slides? Are the presentation slides up? We've got the presentation. Now you can see me. Now, okay, now we have. So just to add to the introduction, I'd like to say that this is really not about learning explicitly or directly from what China did, but what China did is a great reference point. So it doesn't imply that any country should do what China did at all. It's just a very useful overview of the links between population and development. So next slide, please. So, okay, so this is the presentation structure really focuses on China, not on Africa. So it's about kind of learning what China did and how it got to be this aging upper middle income economy in terms of, and it's thinking constantly about links between population and development. So we'll give a quick survey and see indeed how youth rich, how child rich Africa is. Then have a look like how did China get where it is to be this old country today? And this key concept that was invented in the 1980s of getting old before rich, which may be something that's particularly useful for African countries going forward, or may not be, but nonetheless incredibly useful to always benchmark against. And then since China is old before rich, can it get rich? Can it overcome the fact that it got old before it got rich? And what might that look like? And then kind of summarize that into how it might be or might not be relevant in the case of African countries. Next slide, please. So the first part's a survey of African demographic dividend proximity. So next slide. So the World Bank has these great indicator series. So a lot of people are currently talking about the potential of demographic dividend in Africa, which is the demographic dividend is strictly the potential that can be reaped from having a high working age population share. So even if you have a really rich working age population share, it doesn't mean you capture the dividend. You have to have policies to capture it. And so the World Bank has these great indicators that can kind of tell you how far post or pre-demographic dividend a country is based on its current total fertility rate, based on the share of children and then based on the share of seniors. So these are the 2019 indicators, except the total fertility rate, which is 2018. And then I have just kind of converted these, you know, a bit crudely into 5 different phases. So if your total fertility rate is lower than the pre-dividend World Bank threshold rate for total is, i.e. 4.9. If it's greater than 4.9, then I call that a high total fertility rate society. And then same if it's between the pre and early dividend total fertility rate threshold, then I call that demographic dividend prospect, which, because that implies that the demographic transition has begun, but it doesn't at all mean that a country is actually close to that working age population rich point. And so you have these. So if we jump to the next slide, that's the kind of background. So you can really use those World Bank statistics to get a sense. And then this is all African countries by the child share indicator and those phases. So you can see like a low total fertility rate society, which elsewhere in the world would be kind of Japan, South Korea, and so on. There aren't any African countries in that phase. But late demographic dividend era is Mauritius. Like it has 17.3% of its population are children. You know, you jump to the kind of other extreme, and you have Nigeria, where half the population are aged under 15. You know, so this is a kind of, if you were to look, I think Hong Kong is something like 10%, and you know the other extreme is Nigeria, the kind of 2 extremes of the old and young of the world by this child share measure. And Kenya is in the demographic dividend prospect. So, you know, not quite having got the late demographic dividend era is really when that's when you get the working age population rich share between demographic dividend potential and late demographic dividend. So Kenya's not quite there yet, but it's on the way. Next slide, please. And so then you see basically it's the same. So Mauritius is the oldest country in Africa. The North African countries and Indian Ocean islands tend to be the next old, and then, you know, it's mainly Central Africa, which is the youngest. But you can see this also depends on longevity. So I'm not actually a demographer, I'm an economist. But so you can see how this kind of just gives you a sense of Africa's population structure, that most countries have entered the demographic transition, but they're not yet in the demographic dividend rich period. They have a kind of a way to go in terms of population structure change. Next slide, please. So aging China. So China's obviously now at the tail end of its demographic dividends. So, you know, what happened between it being this kind of Maoist child-rich country and today? And how did they capture the demographic dividend? Next slide, please. So you can basically see, so in Mao's China in 1960s and 70s, no, in the 1950s and 60s, natality was encouraged, like families were encouraged to have lots and lots of children. So by you know, there's different statistics, but the total fertility rate peaked in the late 1960s at something like 6, or by this like 6.5. So some of these have been that sometimes the figures are adjusted, but basically China went from having where most women were having 6 children to then, by, you know, kind of, you see in actually the main transition happened in the 1970s, where the birth rate came right down, part of a government encouragement campaign, and then that trajectory was kind of fixed at a low total fertility rate going forward, thanks to the one-child policy. And what that did was produce this kind of corollary, incredible boost in working age population share. So all those babies born in 1950s and 60s China kind of appeared as workers by, you know, 1980, and then were the frontier of China's economic rise from 1980 on to the around 2010. Next slide, please. And so, you know, what does that mean? Sorry, I haven't updated the second pyramid. I need to update it. But you can see the 1980 China's population looked a little bit like, you know, probably a demographic dividend prospect. country in Africa would look today. You know, relatively young, like biased towards the youth, but you can see a sign that demographic transition has begun because the 0 to 4 group is already starting to shrink. And then by 2015, you know, you have this, you have a almost like a more of a cylinder, or approaching a cylinder. So also remember, when China launched this opening and reform era, its demographic transition had begun. They didn't launch it when China was when women were having 6 babies each. They launched it kind of right at this point when the working age population share was about to take off, and they grabbed that opportunity with all sorts of incentives and so on. Next slide, please. So you just see, so this is not so important. So the median age, of course, as a result of that demographic transition. So China had a median age of 22 in 1980, which is a little older than a lot of sub-Saharan African countries today. And by 2020, the median age is almost 40. So, you know, like really an incredible demographic shift in a relatively short period of time. Next slide, please. Next slide. Can we jump to the next slide, please? Yeah, here we go. Oh, sorry, back one. Okay, so China is now aging, and you know it tends to be very aware of the fact that it's aged very rapidly thanks to these population policies. But in fact, a kind of a backdrop to the China story is that a lot of countries are now getting older, even without necessarily getting rich. So, you know, if you take this this is like I think it's 182 countries, again using World Bank data. This was from a study I did. So the 1996 and 2006 years are a little random. You could take different years and get slightly different percentages and numbers. But so you have the total number of countries, 182. By share of old, is in like there's these 3 very basic empirical indicators. If your share of population age 65 and over is above 7%, you're considered a population aging country. If your share of youth is less than 30%, same thing. And then the ratio of the two. And so by this share, you see in 1996, 31.1% of countries were considered aging by a 7% indicator. But by 2016, it was already 41%, nearly 42. But really the share of young is where you see the dramatic change. So it was 35% of countries were considered aging by the child share indicator in 1996, but 61 out of 182 by 2016. So you can see this is really an aging trend, and to some extent, thanks to health improving in different countries around the world, so longevity is rising, more women are going to school and so on, that this transition towards getting older is happening almost regardless a little of the per capita income level, or it's happening more quickly than the per capita income is rising. So countries are getting older faster than they're getting richer. And this is really this relationship between how quickly your demography changes and how your economy changes is what China has been thinking about for much longer than everyone else. So in this presentation, I'm not trying to advocate any type of demographic transition or any type of growth strategy. What I'm trying to do is to communicate China's understanding of how you work with those rates of change over time and how you work with them together, so that if your country looks like it will be old before rich, how do you prepare for that? Like, how do you take that? And that's really what China did so brilliantly. Next slide, please. So you see, so China might not be so old like one, but it's basically now getting much, much older. So it's just a slide looking forward. So, even though China has just launched a 3-child policy, nobody's expecting rapid population growth. That is really about allowing families with 2 children who want 3 to have a third, but many families don't want that 3rd child anymore. So hence this shift of population structure, the gray area. You see China's working age population share falling and the share of old falling, and from later this decade, the whole total population falling. So, China's population will get smaller, but per capita, presumably it will become much richer over time. So it's like getting smaller but richer. Next slide, please. And so what to me, this was like a key. What is this getting old before rich? So I'm going to explain this concept from China as I understand it, in part because it might be the case that many African countries, depending what happens to their demographic transition, also get old before they become a high income country. And, it used to be the case countries got rich first, but if they now get old first, what can be learned from China? Because China planned for that for a long time in advance. China really came up with this concept and planned for it over time. So next slide, please. So this is a bit of a text heavy slide, sorry. So old before rich. So you saw the slide earlier where China's total fertility rate fell dramatically from the 70s and has stayed flat since the 1980s, especially 1990s. Like, what started that? So in the kind of late 60s, early 70s, I think Chinese officials started to worry that China's population was growing so quickly it wouldn't be able to feed, the 1 point, by around 2000 or so. They thought, wow, we'll have 1 billion people, then we'll have 1.5 billion people. Like, how can we keep feeding these people? And so then there was obviously, there was also some famines. So that combination then led, instead of encouraging births, the Chinese government encouraged women to wait later to start a family, wait longer between each child, and have fewer children overall. A campaign called the Longer Later Fewer campaign. And then, this was because they thought, wow, we can't have a population growing so quickly. We'll never be able to modernize and get rich. And this was part of their agenda also. And so then, obviously, in 1978, there was this, change. China launched opening and reform and went from being a closed off economy to an open one. And I just put this in here because they were very lucky that the day after Deng Xiaoping made his now famous speech launching opening and reform, the UN passed a resolution on population aging. And it was a resolution that China supported, and it called for worldwide attention to this rapid aging in rich countries, mostly. And then in 1980, 2 years later, China went from like encouraging fewer births and later births to just allowing only 1 child per family. So this kind of extreme from, high natality to 1 child each. And 1 child each was really about making sure that the family, all those 5 babies per woman born in the 1960s, didn't all have 5 babies each, because this would have meant China's population grew unbelievably. So that the massive cohort born in the 1960s, effectively the 1 child policy meant they would only have 1 child each, and hence the population structure would change so dramatically. And then at that point, having kind of had such a population boom and then suddenly a population growth rate shrinkage, then also if in the case of imposing a 1 child policy, this really made the government partly implicitly responsible for making sure that this, population restriction would produce much, much higher living standards for everybody. And so this, really started this thinking. And luckily, in combination with that UN resolution, there was a UN conference in 1983, I think, on aging in Vienna. And China sent some people to participate in that. And the people who participated in that set up China's first national population aging committee. And then by 1986, you have a demographer from Renmin University in Beijing who was kind of looking with colleagues at, the potential growth rates. So all the different possibilities for how China could grow looking forward. But what would happen to the population? And there was basically no trajectory at via which China could get rich before it would get old. Like once you projected forward the demographics, you know, you could see the period that China would be rich in working age population, and there was just no growth rate that you could reach to make sure China got rich when it was young. So this came up with this concept in Chinese of old before rich. China will be old before rich, old before rich. And this, you know, if we jump to the next slide, please. Oh, this is just another. This probably, we can jump to the next one, so you can. That's not so important here. Next slide, please. Yeah. And so, why was old before rich a concern? So why did China get so obsessed that it would be old before rich? So the first was that China had a tendency to look at the growth success of Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Macau, and so on, and learn lessons from their success. But all of those economies had got rich before they had got old. So China's like, wow, like that, maybe you can only get rich when you're young. Maybe it's not even possible to get rich when you're old. So there was like no roadmap. So they had to kind of work out, how can we possibly get rich after we get old? And what would it mean? You know, once you're old, like today, modern China is working out, how can we redirect resources to support the elderly, to pay all these pensions, to give them the care they deserve and they need, and give them the health, you know, benefits they need, without stopping the growth process, because China's only an upper middle income country and it wants to become a high income one and continue to develop. But if it has to keep directing so much resources to the elderly, maybe that will become a kind of old age trap and they won't be able to grow anymore. So they were thinking about this really when they were like as young as Kenya is today. Like, wow, based on this rate of population change, at that point in time, we're going to have so many old people, but we're not going to have the resources or whatever. And on top of that, you know, we'll experience wage pressure. You know, we won't have this abundant, cheap labor anymore. And so, but we won't be a rich country, so we'll have expensive labor, but not the technology advantages. So how can we prepare? Like, we'll be old before rich. This might be our curse. We won't be able to keep growing. Next slide, please. And so, and then this is slightly a bit economicsy, sorry. So working age population share turning point, they could project this because they had fixed the rate of population growth effectively with the one-child policy. They could roughly tell when, you know, their working age population share would start to fall way back in the 1980s. So it's like, okay, we've got like 35 years to capture this period, and then we'll start to, you know, lose our rich working age population. And it just happened that like this model of development in economics called the Lewis turning point, the Lewis model, which is effectively where informal workers from the rural sector move incrementally into cities and into industrial jobs, then that helps to create, you know, increased productivity, because there's more productivity in being in those locations, industrially and urban, than in being informally in the rural sector. And this is a model that also generates rapid productivity growth until you run out of informal labor. So, you know, once basically all the factories have consumed every informal laborer, every kind of city has absorbed the informal rural labor, then there's none left. There's no more being born into that same informal agricultural context. And in China's case, they worked out that it would be roughly at the same point that the informal labor would dry up as China's population, you know, would start to age. So you'd basically have these two wage pressures that would really compound China's middle income trap fears. And so then they're like, so from way back in the 1980s, they were thinking, how are we going to manage that? How are we going to keep getting rich, to keep getting richer once we're older and we've run out of these informal labor, like, but we're still not rich at that point. Next slide, please. And so this is all countries, not China, just a kind of a poor old China in context. So one of the reasons I got interested in this topic several years ago was I really I actually couldn't stand the way this concept of old before rich was discussed. It was discussed like a mythical Chinese challenge, like a mythical something that China needed to overcome. But I didn't understand. I thought if you have like old, if you're poor and old, this is just a relationship between economics and demography. And so then this is just at a point in time, and it's a couple of years ago. But you can see all countries like, there's poor old countries. The poor old countries are the ones in the top left-hand corner, where they have more than 7% over 65 in their population, but their per capita income is not in the high income group. So, and then you have all the countries in the bottom left-hand corner, which is mostly sub-Saharan Africa, but not all sub-Saharan Africa. And there's countries outside. And then you have the very rare group of countries in the bottom right, which are per capita income rich, but also young. They tend to be oil exporters like Qatar, Saudi Arabia. And then the top right-hand corner, you have all the rich old countries. So this is mostly the OECD and European Union member countries, but again, not exclusively. There's a few additional ones. But so you see, like, and I thought, how can you even understand the challenges of getting old before rich if you don't understand the movement of all of these countries over time? And maybe even countries are now getting rich when they're old. Like, it was like as if China was still in the 1980s, but maybe everything had changed. And actually what China was thinking was surely relevant to every country. And even at another extreme, I always thought, if old before rich is a challenge, what about getting old after rich? Maybe getting old after rich is worse. So you see, I just never saw it as a Chinese challenge. It's like a relationship between economics and demography. Next slide, please. And so from that, you can kind of get this, what I came up with, which is this economic demography matrix, where you can have all countries. There's a very binary concept, but where you have rich and young countries, you have poor and old, poor and young countries, rich and old, and poor and old. And you kind of understand all countries in this context. And are they getting older faster than they're getting richer? Are they, how are they kind of moving? So rather than just seeing countries as a function of their per capita income, you can see them this way as a function of their economic demography. Like, are they rich and young, and what does that mean? Are they rich and old? What does that mean? And so in China's case, they were obsessed with what Japan had done and Singapore and so on. And in their cases, they'd gone straight from being poor and young to being rich and young and then rich and old. But China needed to work out a poor and young, poor and old, and then rich and old. That's been its strategy. So that's just a different way to see it. Next slide, please. And then this is all countries by that matrix. So you can see the yellow ones are the poor old ones, like China. They're not necessarily poor. China's like got a per capita income of, I think, nearly 12,000 or 10, so not somewhere like $11,000 now. And the green ones are the poor young ones, and the very rare ones, rich young, are the red ones, and the rich old ones are in blue. So you can see, like, just really how disproportionately young Africa is, and this potential, the kind of future of the demographic dividend, at least in that sense. So next slide, please. So can poor old China get rich? Do countries get rich once they get old first? Next slide, please. This is slightly text heavy, sorry, but it just shows since 1988 the demography of countries getting when they enter the high income group, which I appreciate is not a per capita income of $40,000, but at least it's an initial indicator of getting rich. And so you can see here that, where in Korea's case, it got the indicators are down the bottom and at the top. So in Korea's case, in fact, it was old. It didn't get rich when it was young by every indicator. It got rich when it was already old by child share, but was young by the others. And then you see most countries, but not all countries, in fact, are now entering the high income group when they're already old. So Mauritius actually entered, this table slightly, there's a couple more countries have been added since. Mauritius entered the group when it was old by every indicator in 2019, but slipped out thanks to Corona last year. And you see Oman, which is oil rich, it entered the high income group when it was young. Seychelles is a bit of a mix. So you see, it's not strictly that countries now get rich when they're young by any means. And in fact, most countries get rich when they're old. So, China's 1980s fear that it would be so unique in getting old before rich has turned out to be a little displaced just because the demographic transition is happening a bit faster than the economic transition in most countries, and may also be that way in Africa, and maybe not. But at least to think about the links and how they each impact each other over time seems to make sense. Next slide, please. And so this is just, again, this is it links to the base year, and the probabilities would change slightly by using a different interval time. But you can see, so based on this 181 countries and using the old age indicator, that if you take countries in 1986, those that were old and lower middle income, 21% of them entered the high income group by 2016. So 10 years later, you had, 20 years later, you had, like 20% or more than 20% had entered the high income group. But in the case of the young ones, it was a lower percentage. Young and lower middle income, none had entered the high income group. But old and lower middle income, 21% had. And then young and upper middle income, only 16% had entered the high income group by 2016. But of the old and upper middle income countries, 70% had. So you can see actually that, just at least based on this interval, which the years are chosen because 1996 was, apart from being a clean 20-year period, that really to get all the transition economies like Poland and Slovakia and Slovenia in, it had to be from the 1990s, so it was just a bit easier. But so you can see basically the most probable transition path is first old upper middle income, and then old rich. It's not from young to old anymore by any means. The countries that have the highest probability of getting rich are the ones that are old first. So next slide, please. And so this was like China's approach. So how did China approach that? Like, if they're going to be old before rich, how can they work that out? Like, how do they make sure that getting old first doesn't derail their agenda? So this is at least my interpretation of what they chose to do. As I started just looking at the old before rich, but then the more I dug in, the more I saw how much of this kind of planning there was over time. So 1980s, 1990s, this is, they have this one-child policy enhanced demographic dividend, and they opened up to foreign investment. They created lots of incentives to open factories and, allowed migrant workers to move around the country with more freedom to go and work in those factories. And then at the same time, they implemented some education reforms. And by no means is it perfect. It's not like everyone in China is suddenly perfectly educated by today. But things like, compulsory literacy or compulsory primary education, and trying to offer some subsidies for that. So again, it's very lumpy. Like, children in Shanghai have, unbelievable educational resources. Children in rural, poorer areas don't. But nonetheless, this focus, because China realized that the future workforce, once you have population aging, then, after that demographic dividend, you have a smaller working age population share, and they have to they have to be able to be productive such that they can fund the retirement of all these old people, both directly and indirectly, just because they're missing from the workforce now. And you might have to be productive enough to pay their pensions while still developing. So China made sure that though its big working age population share wasn't human capital rich, that the smaller one after them would at least be relatively rich in human capital and hence able. So, you know, while we were all kind of seeing the factories opening and so on, there was this background push. And so by the 2000s, already starting to prepare for this period of later aging. So starting to improve social security, pensions, health spending. None of it is perfect today. And I appreciate that all countries have their own institutions. So it may not be that a pension system evolves the same way or so on. But this is at least what China did. It was already thinking, okay, wow, by the 2020s, we'll have hundreds of millions of pensioners. And we need to have some, at least basic systems in place. And then by the 2010s, which is basically when China's working age population share peaked, then already like really actively promoting new kind of capital intensive sectors in science and universities and so on. And just to go back to the 1990s, also when the one-child policy kids reached university age, the Chinese actually increased the number of university places. Even though there was fewer people, they wanted to make sure that generation was newly educated. And so then you can kind of see how, you know, and then even now they're like making sure to grab opportunities like of population aging in other countries. So always looking at this kind of economic demography frontier. Where is the market? Now there's this massive market for healthcare in China. So that's being developed, as is wealth management, pensions. So a kind of a very continuous and deliberate strategy to make sure economics and demography are optimized over time as best as possible. Next slide, please. So what might that look like? Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. And so just to have a kind of a look, so 1978 to 2000, I'll try and speed along, was what the Chinese called the Wenbao period. So that was really focused on like making sure everyone had food and clothing, like just basic poverty alleviation to reach everybody. And then the next part is this Xiaokang, which is what China is celebrating, you know, now and in July next month. So basic, like the end of absolute poverty. And then this next period, the socialist modernization period, will population aging derail China? Presumably not. If anything, it will accelerate China's growth because China's been preparing to increase its modernization and its technology exactly now. Just when they run out of labor advantage, they're going to foster technological advantage. You know, so where China was really competition for labor-rich Africa for the last few decades, now it's probably more competition for rich countries because it's moving into rich country areas. So you see how that links to the demographics and how they prepared for that over time. Next slide, please. And the same thing, the current 5-year plan really emphasizes these. We can jump to the next slide. That's not important. And so R&D expenditure, all these things going up to like accommodate for the fact that they've now lost their labor intensive advantages. They're building human capital advantages, but they were building the groundwork for this all through the demographic dividend period. It's not an accident that they're able to do this today. It was really a long run concurrent strategy. Next slide, please. And even the Belt and Road, which obviously has a bit of a Kenya link with the SGR and so on, that's also part of reaping the next demographic dividends. So now they have these savings, like so much savings from people saving during their working prime to invest that in growth abroad. And even, you know, potentially in Africa and elsewhere's demographic dividend growth. So they shift from being an inbound investor to becoming an outbound investor. And that's also part of the growth strategy. Next slide, please. Can we jump back? Have we finished the slides? Yeah, next, yeah. And then this all fits. They have this medium and long-term population aging plan, and it's really about proactively responding. So now that they're accelerating into aging, they need to work on the pensions and so on. I'm going to try and finish it. This is just to communicate that long run, like the whole thing has been a continuous proactive response to economics and demography. Next slide, please. So as a reference point, so just round up. So, what can other countries learn, whether they're poor and young, rich and old, whether they stay young? Like, it's not, and this is not advocacy for getting old. This is just have a look at your economic demography. So, so this is, so Keynes had, warned countries, this is less relevant to Africa, except to understand the growth environment. So when China grew, the West, where it did most of its trade, was demographically young also. So now the West and China are both demographically old, and if they don't manage this aging process, then it might have aggregate demand problems and political tension problems, and that will also create a different context for Africa's growth. It won't necessarily be bad, but it's a different environment. Africa's demographic dividend will take place in an aging world, which China's didn't. So you have to kind of plan for that. Just like China planned, it's just always looking at what is the circumstance. So that's just a difference of Africa's demographic dividend potential environment will be different. Next slide, please. Again, we can jump. So basically, it's just a reminder of the plan, and whatever happens to your demography, you should kind of have that same plan. Like if you stay a young country, or if you're, then how do you cater economically to a very young country? Is there a way to have an economic development while being a young country? Next slide, please. Again, just a reminder, like, how you move across this space over time, and at least to plan for it. Are you getting old before rich? Are people living longer? Are they having healthier lives, fewer children? If you get old before rich, at least work out the consequences and how you should change taxes, how you should change incentives as those things change. Next slide, please. And this is just quickly, I won't go into it because I know we're short of time, but this is actually from another presentation, but just to communicate the difference between China and, say, Japan. So China is old before rich. Japan is rich after it got old. So whereas when Japan had a really high working age population share, they were quite well educated, at least disproportionately. More of them had gone to university and so on. And so now as they retire, that means Japan loses high income and well-educated workers. Whereas in China's case, that big population share that was the dominant one, they almost barely even finished primary school, let alone high school. So, so what China is now focused on is, though they're losing workers, they're actually gaining, like, the total human capital of the workforce is still increasing. So every year they're like, wow, the average worker now has 12 years of schooling versus last year there was only 10, or not last year, but 5 years ago there was only 10. So you can see this very strategic, like, we're losing workers, but we're gaining human capital. This is the strategic thinking they had, which Japan was never thinking about. It may be thinking about today, but it wasn't during all those years. But thanks to China being paranoid that it was old before rich, they were like, how can we make sure our workforce is still able to deliver once it starts to shrink? Next slide, please. Can we jump this? That one's not important given time. And so this is, again, just a kind of a generic, what do you do if you're a younger country? Can anyone else see the slide? I think we've lost the slide, but it doesn't matter. It's basically just a kind of a generic reference point. If you have a very young country and you're in not even necessarily having a intensifying demographic transition, if you want a demographic transition, and only if you want it, to help spark that. So that involves educational and health investments, especially because it's about reducing mortality. And then the reduction in mortality tends to decrease the number of births and so on. So that would be working with foreign partners or not. And that just depends even if you want it. Whereas older populations, they're like working out how do they use their savings. And one of the publications listed at the end has this in detail, but you can just see this as a general introduction to how do you work with a different population age structure in the economy over time, and always keeping your eye on that change and its long run implications, the way China did. Next slide, please. And it's just a reminder, I thought we'd come back with, like, I hardly mentioned Africa during the presentation, but, you know, in light of that strategy, all these, you know, pretty young countries, but they're early in the demographic transition, earlier than what China was in 1980. They're more like China in the 1970s. And so whether the demographic transition goes in the Chinese direction or not, that's really not the point. The point is to understand the economic demography of other countries and the opportunities that presents, and to understand how to utilize your own population structure and development, whatever dimensions it takes over time. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the final. So African countries will obviously have their own, like, the economy will interact at its own speed with demographic change, however that goes. Family aging, you know, back in China in 1980, if you told people of the kind of relative separation of family life now, you know, it might not have been believed. So maybe you'll need pensions in future, where today's family context, you can't imagine that, where children are just obviously supporting their parents. So all these things will be different. And of course, Africa also has much more technology potential. So that could be a threat to its demographic dividend, or an asset to the demographic dividend. And also, of course, you've got this aging. If the demographic dividend comes, it's in a world of old countries elsewhere. So it happens, in fact, that China has a population and development unit set up in Nairobi. So just that's the kind of population and development stream of the Forum on China Africa. I think that's the last slide. The next one is just references. So again, that final point is not at all to project that African demographic transition should look like China's, but just the constant deliberation of how the two fit together. And if it looks like you're getting old, will you get old before rich? And how should you prepare for that? Like, how do you prepare the next generation? How do you prepare the economy? That's really, to me, the great wisdom from the Chinese approach, and that came from getting old before rich. Thank you. I hope that was useful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lauren. It was definitely very useful. And thanks a lot for preparing and sharing with us that very insightful presentation. I think you've definitely shared some very useful pointers, especially regarding economic demography planning, especially for the countries that are young and poor, like we have here mainly in Africa. So I think we just go straight to the next part of the program, where we'll have some feedback from our colleagues, and we'll start with some comments from our CEO, Mr. Kwame Owino, and then I'll invite the others. So Kwame, please.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Lauren. I think the question of population, I have 4 main points, but I think the question of population and economic demography is an essential one, and I think it's one that even we at the IEA cite in passing, but I think it's one we must place in the center of all our engagement in the future for 2 reasons. One of the things is we think there's a bias in discussing Africa, not just globally, but even internally. When people talk about Africa's resources, they talk about the natural resource side. And I think that's an area that's been studied quite a bit. And then, of course, there's a passing reference generally to the demographic dividend and which countries will have it and what it means for Africa. But I think something that's more as detailed as what you've provided us for, actually, that it's just not food for thought, but actually tells you how important it is at all times to maintain our fingers on the pulse of what's happening, both especially in the matrix that you drew about economic development, economic demography matrix. So I think that's an essential point. So thanks for giving us this. The second point that I make is just one that I think in my mind is like a conundrum. Everybody hears about China's great success and pulling, depending on what estimate you read, from 400 million to 600 million people out of poverty, all within a single generation. And that's an impressive thing. What we hear less about, or rather, and when we hear about the population control part, it's often spoken about as if it had unintended consequences. Some of those, of course, being what we hear about the significant shift in ratios, the sex ratios between men and women, and some of the, unpleasant consequences those might be. What I was completely unaware about is that as early as 1980, China already knew that its development trajectory would actually leave it poor, old, before it got rich. So that was new to me, and it's quite an interesting and a fascinating thing to see here, because I've heard that spoken about, but I didn't know that China was actually conscious about it. I think one other thing that occurs to me is that you're right and I think you're being circumspect about not advocating for one or the other policy for Africa, because it's definitely fast. I think African countries generally will take different trajectories. Is it possible that some will have the conventional achievement of being rich when you're young or not too old? I think a couple maybe have it in short within their I think many more will actually struggle with it unless something really conscious is taken, because while China maintained very high economic growth rates for a generation and a bit, over 10, a few African countries actually have that consistency. But I think on the population side, it is much, much more possible that those total fertility rates will decline. Meaning that I think many more African countries will actually have to watch China's views more keenly. Evidence, progress much more keenly, because then it's important for actually isolating lessons and options for policy and how that does. The final point that I'd like to make is one that it means, the population questions aside, I think Africa's problem, and let me speak about Kenya specifically, I think that Kenya's main economic growth challenge comes from the population structure, and that's the question of jobs. And I will not qualify by talking about things such as good jobs or decent jobs or not, just jobs a lot. Just jobs. Jobs and the productivity that actually ensures, would ensure Kenya's prosperity in order to meet its own, to meet the country's development objectives. Now you have told us that this thing is more complicated than simply speaking about jobs, because the demographic transition that's occurring in China, because it was such a big country, interfaces with global demand and supply of labor and products with countries that are also some of the biggest in quote unquote the West generally used, in a way that's going to change global demand for goods and services, that requires that Kenya be more clear about assessing that global and external demand to fit its development plans out here. That's something that was completely not evident to me until I've seen that. But I think it's such an essential point in my view, because the idea about goods and services and the idea that low wage labor is what Africa or Kenya would bring in, and then follow the same trajectory that China took, which is just basically low labor, bringing in more people into urban areas to work in factories, and then compete globally in terms of the cost of labor, and then push out goods and then go up the value chain over time. Means I think new value chains will exist, but there'll be value chains that are different from the value chains of the 80s and 90s. That's Africa's and Kenya's new development challenge, and I think it's something we need to bear in mind. But anyway, thanks a lot for a good paper. And I think everybody needs to be alerted that this is a paper. It's going to be published in a journal, and you let us know and we'll circulate that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Kwame, for that feedback. We go now to my other colleagues, Maureen and Anna. Maureen, would you like to, I'm sure you have something to add to Lauren's presentation. You're welcome.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. For me, I'd like to say thank you to Lauren for her contribution in looking at China's experience of demographic dividends and development, and looking at the transition of how the one-child policy has influenced China, as well as China's fears of getting old before getting rich, and what lesson do African countries have to take from this one? And I have a few pointers that I'd like to make. In the paper, she mentioned China's approach in implementing the one child per couple policy was for reducing the dependency ratio, increasing income per capita, as well as the welfare. And from the paper that she presented just a few minutes ago, we can see that the population moved towards an old and poor population. And in my opinion, I think expenditure on healthcare for an old and poor population, such as the one China has grown into, will be higher than that of a young and poor population like the one we have in Africa, as well as the dependency ratio, where we'll have to take care of the older population and we'll have to pump in more funds and resources towards the older population. Secondly, in a period of high population aging, that is a shrunk workforce and there's a broadened population of retirees. You mentioned that we'll have to create new sources of growth to increase economic growth. Yeah, we'll have to identify that, and China already identified that by moving from a labor-intensive sector towards the service industry, such as the road construction and all. And I was asking whether will this transition model be applicable to Africa with it being technologically, okay, at the moment you're technologically backward, as well as our our economy is dependent on the labor-intensive industry. The third question that I had was China's population has shifted towards old and poor, and you mentioned it creates new markets for labor from young and poor countries like those in the African continent. They'll go and get jobs like those of taking care of the older population. But I feel like it creates a contradiction, since it will make sense for an old and rich population to create new labor market source for young and poor countries. And will this be sustainable for a continent such as Africa, which is young and poor? Okay, that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Maureen. Finally, we go to Anna Grace. Anna, please share your thoughts.
Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Lauren, for the presentation. It was quite interesting for me to discover the similarities between Kenya and China. A 1980 China, whereby the median age was about 22 years old, and Kenya's right now is about 21 years. Also that the demographic dividend period lasted for about 40 years, and it's estimated that Kenya has about 30 to 40 years for Africa before the larger population starts to age. So those are two similarities that I found quite interesting. And also the fact that you mentioned that there's a 69% probability that a poor old country would transition into a rich old country. And I think that's nice. But I'm wondering the fact that by the time Africa gets to its demographic dividend era, most of the world would already be old. Do you think that would pose a challenge for African countries? Because I'm seeing like China, when they went through the demographic dividend, they were able to now extend, like say, their foreign direct investments into poor young nations. I'm not saying that when Africa gets there, there wouldn't be poor young nations, but is that challenge specifically unique? Or how do you think Africa would face such a challenge? My next question is about the coronavirus pandemic and how it being a virus that makes the old particularly more vulnerable. do you think it has or will have a significant effect on China's demographic structure, probably affecting the dependency ratios? I'd like to hear your take on that. And also, the one-child policy that China implemented in the 80s has been shown or proven to have unintended effects, like the fact that now China is poor while still old, but also the fact that there's a big gender disparity with more males than females, probably due to the preference for the male child in China. But how is this affecting China's demographic structure moving forward? I know that they quashed the one-child policy, became two-child policy, now it's three-child policy. Do you think these changes are catching up with the effects that the one-child policy had on the demographic structure? And also, are they sufficient to correct for it? And finally, do you think Kenya in particular would benefit from a rapid family planning policy? Thank you.
All right. Thanks to all my colleagues that are here, and I think the floor is now yours, Lauren. Before we go to plenary, you can respond to the three comments we've had.
Thank you, everyone, for the comments, and I'm glad to see the kind of parallels. I'll try and take them as a whole. I didn't take down kind of particular questions, but on the I think it's really fundamentally important to understand. Like, I think nobody paid enough attention to the fact not only did China enjoy and reap, like put in a very deliberate approach to capture the demographic dividend, but the fact that its demographic dividend coincided with the OECD demographic dividend probably doesn't get enough attention. So you had this kind of low wage demographic dividend in China met like a high wage demographic dividend in the West. And it was kind of a perfect symphony until about 2008, when the demographics started to, decline, and the imperfections of that model, came to the fore. But so obviously now, so Africa's a late developer in the demographic sense, and I'm not even suggesting it will get old or get whatever. Like its demographics will go in each country as they go. But presumably, if health standards keep improving, longevity will improve. So even if people are having fewer but still many babies, there will probably still be many more older people, just because longevity will rise. So the aging will happen even if the fertility rate, is a bit slower to come down, just based on longevity. There'll be some aging. How do you prepare? That's like, how do you make sure that Africa doesn't suffer because its demographic dividend is late? I think you have to behave like China did in 1980s, where it implemented this, like its demographic transition had been hastened, and it calculated out, this old before rich fear came in the 1980s, and they were looking at every possible trajectory of, can we get rich before we get old? Like, there's really just no way we can do that. So, and then it wasn't as if they had a roadmap for, okay, well, how can we try to get rich before, like after we get old? That this is like a 40, 50 year map, and not having control of all the variables. So I just think you need to do the same equivalent today. Like Kenya would need to say, wow, like we need to find an export strategy that works both within the African context, and if we're exporting to China and Japan and the West, how do we export to population aging nations? Like, so China, I didn't go into it, but in one of those slides, there's a town in China now that makes not most, but a good share of Japan's coffins. So they've just looked at aging Japan and they've thought, what are the new markets? And when there are, it's a grim topic, but if there are 2 people dying for every person being born, then obviously there'll be a market for coffins, providing people get buried. So, you have to just look at the changing structure and do exactly what China did, work out a way to turn it to your advantage, or at least to make it work. And, I completely agree on that. Like, how will the rich old countries interact with the poor young ones? I mean, this is a classic Europe, Africa kind of, policy debate that's emerging. I don't know how exactly it will merge. Does that mean there'll be more shifting of labor intensive industries to Africa, the ones that didn't go to China already? Like, I don't know how the equilibrium will emerge, but it's, and of course we have to remember there's so much more technology available today. So, for example, African countries might have some extra challenges around this economic demography lateness, but maybe the mobile technology enables things that China couldn't dream of doing in the 1980s and 1990s. It doesn't have to be a threat. So where the Chinese thought they feared getting old before rich would be a challenge, they developed this strategy to turn it into something that wouldn't be a challenge. And it's not perfect, and as has been noted, the one-child policy has had some other unintended effects. I mean, even the slightly elevated population share of men now of working age, I read a study that said that's actually good for growth, because you have, it makes the dependency ratio more favorable, and you have these men able to be free to work because they're not distracted by family. It's not a perfect situation. It's not, it doesn't work for everybody. And, it was urban environments that were least likely to abort girl fetuses and just to keep their one girl. So you have these, not only do you have a numbers bias, but you also have a kind of educational bias. So there's all sorts of inequalities, and, China, like no one, like any country, it's not perfect. It has policy challenges to keep working with, but at least there's a pragmatism, and maybe part of that comes from the scale. Like, if you need to feed 1.4 billion mouths, you'll at least be putting some time into thinking about it, maybe a little more in the long run than other countries. That's just a guess. So how will countries interact, poor, young, rich, old? How will, as Kwame said, will maybe some African countries will get rich when they're young? I think actually Equatorial Guinea did. So Equatorial Guinea was Africa's first high income economy, but the price of oil crashed and it's not now. So, it's not that all countries will get old before rich, but many will. And even if they're rich and young, then, there's just different, always should be thinking about that, both domestically and internationally, and the different implications. I hope I picked up. And the Kenya family planning. I'm not here to advocate what size anyone should have a family. I think it would be, if people want to have fewer children and they need some support for doing that, in terms of, health or so on, or they want to have them later or whatever. Like, I'm really not. I feel like that's a political landmine. So I'm not encouraging fewer or more births. But if countries can give people options, like to the extent that births might not necessarily, that number of births may not necessarily even be wanted by all those women. Maybe it is. So at least to give people choices is always a good thing. And don't forget, like, looking forward, and China's been very clever in, now it's really going to develop healthcare and so on. I mean, maybe it might be that Kenya can export some instead of exporting toys for children like China did to the West, or whatever, TVs and so on. It might be a medicinal herb that, instead of tobacco even, it might be a medicinal herb that helps the aging process. Like, just have a look at the different demand and different industry structures. And if it's not coffins, maybe it's herbs or whatever it is. Like, just be as deliberate whether you stay poor and young, whether you get rich and old, just be as deliberate and as cognizant of the shifting economic demography of other countries, but also your own. If you're like, Vietnam is actually getting older faster than China did. So be older and poorer, or like older and richer, even faster than China. So it's not even a China story. Vietnam's happened even faster. So that's just my set. Like, just be cognizant of the changes, and make sure, if it looks like the demographic transition is picking up speed, make sure your youth are ready for an old population. Make sure they're well educated. Make sure that the systems are in place so that the aging doesn't derail the future youth. Does that answer everything?
Sure. Thanks a lot for that feedback. So I think we go now to plenary, and I see 2 questions in the chat box. I don't know if anyone has a question that you'd like to ask. So maybe you could raise your hand and I'll see it and point to you if you'd like to ask any question. But as we wait for that, I think I can run through the 2 that we have on this platform. So Wafula Nabutola says, well done, brilliant analysis. So that's to you, Lauren. Then he asks, what is the correlation between political philosophy and economic development? Is politics dominating economic growth / economic development? He asks, how does China manage to feed herself given the huge populace? And then proceeds to ask, why can't Kenya manage to feed herself? I'm not sure you have the response for that last part, but that's our Fuller's question. Maybe you can note it down. Then we go to Beatrice. Beatrice asks, Ethiopia and Rwanda seem to have already figured out what value chains to play in for their comparative advantage. Kenya may lose its competitiveness, whereas they may have benefited from this, the high interest from Chinese investors and their position in the Belt and Road Initiative. So she proceeds to say that maybe Lauren can give an indication of what future she envisages on China's engagement in Africa. At present, there is more exploration of building their technology, capital, knowledge-intensive industries, and I'm not sure how investments in Africa benefits from this. The 14-year plan is more inward focusing than outward. And so what nature of future engagement in Africa do you foresee? So maybe you can attempt to respond to those, because I still don't see any hands. But for participants, you can, after she responds, then we can ask your question. So Lauren?
On why can't Kenya feed itself? Obviously, Kenya does have different politics to China, for better and for worse. I'm not an expert in those particular links, nor even in Kenya. I've visited Kenya, but I'm by no means an expert in Kenya's economic development and political challenges. I guess, after 1949, China had this very rural focus. This is one aspect of their development. Was, on the one hand, we saw Shanghai and Shenzhen, evolve, but there was always a very strong rural focus as well, like a rural productivity. And I think that partly came from terrible famines, in China mid last century. So they had a very strong appreciation, like a lot of China's older cohort, the large cohort, a lot of them have literally experienced hunger when they were kids and seen hunger. So that possibly left a mark that helped in the long run to develop agriculture. But why can't Kenya achieve the same? I'm not sure. Hopefully it can in future. On China and Africa and Ethiopia and Rwanda, I agree with the person asking the question that Rwanda and Ethiopia have unusually close ties to China. Reasons for that are historical. They're part of the politics of those countries. Ethiopia saw an opportunity to become a bit of a China in the sense of, you know, these textile factories and so on, and they grabbed it. This was under the, what's his name? So now I've lost my thoughts. But under the, you know, earlier regime, Kenya has different comparative advantage. Kenya has different exchange rate. Kenya has services advantages that those countries don't have. Kenya has, you know, English as its language, which those two countries don't have to the same degree. So Kenya has more strengths in services as well as what would be in manufacturing and labor-intensive manufacturing. So maybe that's also part of it. And, you know, there may be ways to be more cognizant of those differences and to play to the strengths. So, you know, maybe it would be better for Kenya. Maybe Kenya could have some, I don't know, some schools along the coast, like a summer school for, you know, Chinese kids to come and practice their English while, you know, enjoying the tourism and playing some sports or something. You know, that is something that Ethiopia can't do, and Kenya and Rwanda can't do the same way. So maybe you're not being as creative as you could be in order to capture the different potential based around your competitive strengths, in terms of not as easily being able to become that same factory of the world. But then again, like, look at the agriculture. Is there an aging health miracle herb that Kenya can grow, or can it develop a pharmaceuticals industry both for China and for Africa, with Africa's own growing population? Like, just have a look at the demographics and work out a story for that, and the fact you're English speaking and whatever. Like, maybe there are ways to tap into the China-Africa story that you haven't thought of yet, because you're stuck in this factory model and you think, wow, how do we get these Chinese factories? Maybe it's not Kenya's destiny to become the factory producer the same way it might be for Ethiopia. And that may relate to language, that may relate to a higher income level now already. So just work out your advantages and tap into them, and work out China's needs now and tap into those. Maybe, I mean, tourism and Corona is an issue, but, you know, maybe you can have special something tours for China's, like, Silver Army, like a special tour of Kenya for, you know, 60, 70-year-old Chinese people. You know, work out how to target the new markets. And on Corona, I disagree that China's domestic focus. I think it's international. It obviously, they can't have a strong relationship with the outside world if they're not domestically strong. So you can't get around the importance of the domestic. But I don't think that means they're not interested in the outside world by any means. I think they are, and, you know, they're working with different countries differently. So I wouldn't read things that way. I'll just look at what's changing in China and work out if there are ways to tap into that for Kenya and for China, Kenya and beyond. And then Corona. I don't think Corona, I mean, if I'm not sure it has affected China. You know, there weren't that many deaths in China just because of the way it was managed and contained. There were probably many more per capita deaths elsewhere. And part of that is actually even population structure related. You know, one reason Italy was so affected, apart from the fact that, you know, Europe was a bit less prepared. It hasn't had bird flu recently. It hasn't had SARS. But Italy is incredibly old, like Japan. You know, it has such a high number of people in their 80s now. And, you know, in fact, Italy is almost like the perfect pin-up rich old country. It's probably the most extreme rich old country there is. So most of the money is in the north, and the people in the north live longer and have fewer children than almost anywhere else in the world. So you have this super rich old cluster that was trading a lot with China and very well connected to the world. And that unfortunately also linked it to the world. And so the horrible consequences of that for Europe and so on, I think the corona effect might be bigger on the West, because China was always aware of its population structure and economy, but I don't think the West was until corona. I think corona has given the West a bit of an economic and demographic shock. So maybe, corona will make all countries perhaps a little more prone to be able to take care of their own basic supply chain issues. But I don't think it will change everything. It won't change everything. So I think the corona change will probably be bigger in the West than in China overall, I suspect. I don't think did I miss any questions? I don't think I did. I think is there any other questions? Did I miss something?
No, I think you've covered it. I don't know if anyone else has a question. Would anyone like to orally ask their question? You can raise your hand. Yes, Kwame. Kwame, I see your hand is up.
All right, thanks. There's something that I'd forgotten. One of the things that's one of the things that became salient to me as I listened once again is that economic demography is extremely important. But I don't know why the question of because I mean demography. I'm not a demographer either, but I know that they tend to track the three variables, right? Fertility, mortality, and migration. So the place of migration in economic demography. I mean, I asked that so that Lauren, you could advise. Or what's the place of migration in economic demography? Because I think that one of the things that might limit the policy choices that governments have, if they only think like China's did on many African countries do, that if you examine on the one side fertility rates, then obviously you get the good outcomes by trying to actually raise income per capita. How would the mix of and I know migration is not going to happen soon. I think the world is just basically closing up. Most countries are closing up because of domestic politics. But how would modest migration or some level of migration change the prospects, say, for China in terms of the structure of that? I'm sure it's not going to happen, partly because obviously these involve political choices. Japan hasn't done it either. But what's the place of migration in changing the trajectory of development and how fast a country can change from an old before it's rich? Or rather, let me just ask, what would migration do to that mix of economic growth rates on the one side, growth rates, or economic structure, and the population structure?
I mean, to the extent that young people migrate to old countries, then if there's enough of them, they obviously tilt the balance of the workforce in a younger direction. And migrants, on average, tend to be younger and often more educated. Certainly in the West, migrants tend to be young and educated. Those are the migrants who are allowed to migrate. So that supports, but migrants themselves then tend to settle and have fewer children. So it doesn't, to the extent that even probably one day the supply of migrants in principle might run dry. It doesn't. It's a short-term solution to a kind of a bigger structural challenge. In China's case and in Japan, I mean, East Asia is very interesting because they basically don't have any immigration. So they're kind of closed demographic samples, which enables you to, and what's actually really interesting is Japan is old after rich. South Korea is old as rich, and then you have China, which is old before rich. So these kind of 3 different economic demography transition stories that refuse almost any migration. In China's case, they seem already to, I mean, that there are certain shortages of labor in terms of caring for the elderly, but I've already heard one of their top economists, a professor called Professor Yao Yang, who has spoken of worrying that automation and artificial intelligence might even mean China has to deal with unemployment rather than labor shortages thanks to population aging. So kind of such is their technological upgrade and so successful is their capital intensive push that even though the population structure is now unfavorable from the working age prime, they're already worried about unemployment. So and then they have this, like, some areas of China are much older than other areas. Like, this is a migration story too, because the far northeast of China, many of the young leave and they move to Shanghai or Beijing or Shenzhen, and that leaves their part of China really, really old. So even within China, you have older, poorer parts. And, the Northeast is classic for that. So one of the things, this requires obviously a lot more fiscal coordination. So the rich areas of China need to, agree to have some of their resources directed to the poorer ones that are the sources of migrants. So domestic migration requires a lot of fiscal coordination to compensate areas that provide migrants. But China is even now, it has a kind of agenda to consolidate its geography and its economic geography. So probably by 2050, the relative economic geography of China will be more consolidated than now. So they're almost incentivizing people to move and to live within a certain economic areas that are very rich and will be able to so they're kind of consolidating the population almost. So rather than have everyone spread out and then not able to get the same density of activity as before, they're encouraging people to kind of cluster a bit in the more modern, economically successful areas. So these are the way, so China is having a migration strategy, but it's really a domestic migration strategy as it was in the 1980s and 1990s. So, how will other countries manage migration? I mean, there's obviously lots of workers coming to Europe from different parts of the world for different jobs. If they come and they stay and then they have just 1 or 2 children of their own, it doesn't change the trajectory. It just delays the trajectory. So I guess that's up to any particular country, and even Kenya may ultimately benefit from having workers from Ethiopia or Congo or wherever, or Tanzania, which has a higher TFR than Kenya does. So migration helps, but it doesn't strictly challenge the long run population challenges per se. And my take is that some countries say, well, we should just have immigration and then that solves the problem. It only solves the problem temporarily, and even that's where migrants are a perfect substitute. Often they're more educated than the local labor. But my thing is that migration really should be seen as a bonus, because in the extreme situation where migrants come and there's some political consequences. So, let's say a country has aged badly, and the old in the West, for example, might be the rich group, like they are in many Western economies. So there's old after rich, and then they bring in migrants who then are able to keep the economy going. If the population economic structure issues between the resident population haven't been addressed and migrants come as the solution, the people who maybe missed out on the benefits of the demographic dividend period, you know, there just might be political tensions and so on. So I think migration is a wonderful addition, but I feel like if the population structure issues are not challenged, that it may not be as beneficial as it could be. Like, it can create problems and it doesn't actually solve the long run. It doesn't solve the long run trajectory. So I think it's important, but I really don't want, I think it's imperfect if used as a way to not look at the challenges. Like, I think the challenges should be taken head on, and then immigration can be used to support and to, you know, facilitate growth, to facilitate new areas, new sectors, new everything, like, you know, all that. But I don't think it's an answer, but also because immigrants themselves aren't a kind of in infinite supply. Like, that implies you need to have a high total fertility rate somewhere else. So yeah, I think it's part of the story, but it's not a perfect answer in and of itself for all those reasons. Kwame, does that help?
All right.
Yes, it does. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Lauren. Does anyone else have a question as we wind up? I'd like to give this opportunity to anyone else who'd like to orally ask their question. You can raise your hand. I don't see any hands. So, well, I think in the absence of any further questions, I'd like to maybe then just invite Dr. Lauren to make just her very final maybe remarks in a minute or two, and then I'll conclude the meeting. So, any final remarks that you may have?
I think I've said everything I can think to say. If anyone has any questions, they're welcome to email me. And thank you so much for this opportunity. Like, it was an accident that I got into that longer trajectory just because I had an issue with getting old before rich. I hated the way it was understood outside of China. And then it produced this gold mine of kind of reference points. So I just hope that can be useful. And I hope this seminar was useful. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'll conclude now. And on behalf of the IEA, we'd like to sincerely thank you for taking your time to prepare this presentation and share it with our various audiences. We've had quite a bit of interaction, and we believe it's very useful, and we'll be sharing this. So I don't know, with your permission, we can share the presentation that you've made today. I know it's still a working paper, so it's not yet published. So I'm not sure.
I'll try and get the accepted version of the paper online soon. I'll just check with the journal. I can put the early manuscript online.
Okay, so then we'll be sharing that, and we'll also provide links to that on IEA's digital platform. And once we have the final paper, then we'll also use it to for our other policy discussions. So thanks a lot, and thanks to my colleagues at IEA who also looked at the presentation in depth and tried to share their own feedback. So thanks, Kwame, thanks, Maureen, and thanks, Anna Grace. We also thank all the participants who joined this forum. We hope and believe that it's been useful. Please continue to engage with us on Twitter, and you can email us any further questions that you have, and we'll be glad to respond to you. So IEA is a membership institution. So for those who are interested in joining us, again, please consult our website or our communications team, and they'll be able to assist you. So with that said, thanks everyone. I'd like to now close this meeting and wish you a good afternoon. Thank you. Lauren, bye.
Bye.
Bye, Lauren. Thank you very much. Bye.
Yeah.